They always tell you there's a catch, a compromise, an asterisk. Sprite Zero Sugar? It's different. It's the lemon lime flavored refreshment you want with zero sugar. This is Sprite Zero Sugar. Obey your thirst.
He's a top spy writer. He's a brilliant podcaster. He's a former CIA analyst. He is David McCloskey. His new book, The Persian, shows that he has what it takes, according to the Times newspaper, to establish himself in the top echelons of spy writers ever. We're delighted to have him as the guest on the Spymasters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. Don't forget, subscribe, like, follow wherever you get your podcasts. We've got some amazing guests coming up. But right now, I'm going to hand you over to me talking to David McCloskey about The Persian. David, thank you so much for joining me on the Spymasters podcast.
Antonia, great to be back. Thanks for having me.
It is just such a delight to have you on again and back to talk about your new one, The Persian. It's a brilliant book. I absolutely adored this one. It's quite a departure, I think, from your previous novels. Can you just give us a brief overview for people who haven't read it yet?
Yeah, so the Persian, it's still a spy novel, but it is a spy novel set in the middle of the shadow war between Israel and Iran. There are no Americans in this book, I think, which is part of the reason why it is a departure, because none of the CIA officers from my first three novels are in this one. In fact, there are no Americans at all in this book. And it is a story, of course, like what good spy novel wouldn't have a Persian Jewish dentist as its key protagonist. So it is following the story of a dentist named Kamran Esfahani whose family fled Iran after the revolution, moved to Sweden. So he's grown up in Stockholm for the most part, goes back and forth to Iran. And he is a very dissatisfied dentist. He doesn't like dentistry. He's bored. He doesn't like the Swedish winters. And he wants to move to California and start a new life. And lo and behold, who should show up in his dental chair but an Israeli intelligence officer working for Mossad by the name of Eric Glitzman, who recruits Cam with an offer that I think Cam sort of doesn't want to refuse, but also kind of can't refuse. And it's this. Go to Iran, set up a dental practice, and let us use that as a cover for surveillance, kidnapping, kind of general mayhem in Iran. So Cam does that. It goes well for a little while, but then some very particular people start to get killed inside Israel, and they are Mossad officers of the unit that actually recruited Cam. And so what gets set in motion is this kind of back and forth cat and mouse between the Israeli intelligence services and Iran to determine who in Iran is actually conducting these killings and why. And it's no surprise to say that this goes horribly for Cam, because we learned in the first few pages of the novel that he's writing the book effectively as his confession, because he has been captured by the Iranians, and he's been interrogated and tortured in an Iranian prison for the past 3 years, and the novel is essentially his final confession. So it's a story, I think, about ultimately whether he can kind of hold on to this single secret that we also learn he has been keeping. And of course, it's a story of whether he can hold on to that secret from his captors, but maybe more importantly from us, the reader.
So I read the opening passages, and Cam is being tortured quite graphically in places, and being forced to write this spy novel effectively, because he makes it literary under duress. And I did think, do I need to stage an intervention? David, are you okay? Is your publisher pushing you too hard?
Yeah, it's funny. The my editor, who actually just recently passed, was a huge influence on my writing, and edited my first 4 books, including The Persian. And it was interesting as I was writing this character of the general, who is this kind of psychopathic, interrogator / torturer, and who has been holding and kind of toying with Cam for the past 3 years. I was able to channel elements of my now past editor, who I think actually saw this as a great compliment to his editorial style, that he could be so direct and so devastating. And so I didn't have to do much research on the kind of editorial feedback that the general would provide.
Yeah, I hear you. American editors, formidable people. So the Shadow War is the setting between Israel and Iran. And as you say, there are no Americans. It is very specifically between the Israelis and the Iranians. Now, I want to ask you about why you chose that particular arena. But just before I do, I should probably mention that we're recording this on the 12th of January, a couple of weeks before it's going to come out, a couple of weeks before your book's going to come out. And obviously the situation in Iran currently is so fast moving that as much as we would love to be talking, in great depth about what's going on today, I think, we probably would just be hostage to fortune. So, but what's happening today is part and parcel of a much longer shadow war between Israel and Iran. And tell me about that and why you chose to make that the background for your, this current novel.
Well, so the initial piece of this conflict that got me thinking was that if you go back to 2007, 2008, the Israelis started killing Iranian nuclear scientists in Iran. And the idea, which was kind of the brainchild of the now dead former chief of Mossad, a guy by the name of Meir Dagan, was that you had to kill to save lives. And the concept was basically, if the Iranians get close to a nuclear capability, there's going to have to be a massive conflict with Iran. And in that massive conflict with Iran, potentially tens of thousands of people could die. And so the intelligence service, the Mossad, was sort of entrusted with this. And, Dagan had pushed for this idea that by sabotaging, degrading Iran's capabilities to sort of sprint toward a bomb, it was going to ultimately, save lives. And part of degrading Iran's capabilities was killing the people who knew how to build a bomb, right? Or were engaged in the effort to build it. And obviously, if you're writing a spy novel, the kind of intelligence, the kind of conflict between spy services that involves everything from slapping magnetic explosives onto people's cars in the streets of downtown Tehran and killing them, or kidnapping intelligence officers inside Iran, holding them inside Iran, and filming their confessions and then leaking those confessions to journalists, or using a robotic operated, machine gun that's controlled by satellite uplink to assassinate the head of Iran's nuclear program. These are all things that happened. And from the standpoint of a spy novel, they provide a lot of not only just plot fodder, but a setting that allows some very interesting characters to sort of, spring forth. And so this shadow conflict between spy services, for me, even, going back to kind of the days when I was writing my first novel, I'd always kind of had my eye on writing a book that was set in this sort of milieu, and the Persian is the one that came out of that effort.
It feels so incredibly well researched. As you said, there's lots of real instances in it, some of which are so extraordinary you cannot believe they're real. So the bit you just mentioned about the robotic submachine gun being controlled by satellite, that happens quite early in the novel. And I Googled it. I couldn't believe it was real. And it was a real operation. So can you just talk me through researching a bit like this? Obviously, you're a former CIA analyst, you have contacts, you know people. So how much open source material do you use? How much is it conversations with people who are actually on the ground? I mean, how do you get that level of operational authenticity?
Well, the great the great news again in this kind of shadow conflict is a lot of this stuff does get out there. Like you can get details about that operation to kill Mohsen Fakhrizadeh from some really stellar reporting that Ronan Bergman has done for the New York Times, right? You can get the story about how the Israelis had recruited this whole kind of, support asset / commando network of Iranian sort of, mercenaries, dissidents to help prepare for the operation this past, sort of the conflict this past June. Like there's a great ProPublica piece on the details behind all of this stuff. And so when I'm looking at this conflict and you get a few of these operations, or you at least see pieces of them, right? What I can then do is if I have questions about, well, how did this part happen really? I can go to contacts that I have who, CIA officers who worked extensively with Mossad, or at a few points in the book, in the research for the book, just put the question to Mossad, former Mossad officers themselves, and see what their answer would be. And in some cases you get really cagey answers. In other cases, someone will kind of tell you, well, theoretically in a situation like this, maybe I'd think about doing it this way. And then you're kind of off to the races. So you've at least got some scaffolding of authenticity because you've got either the reporting itself and I find these phone calls and meetings to be really productive, where I could just sort of put a what if scenario to an intelligence officer and have them kind of run with it. And it's nothing, they're not revealing sources and methods. They're not telling me how an actual operation went down. They're taking all of their experience and their knowledge of, Mossad, its tradecraft, to say, well, here's kind of how this might happen in your situation. And that's gold as a spy novelist.
I think one of the things that talking to these guys and also having been in that world, one of the things that it gives you is that when you read the book, and this is true of all your books, I think, that sense that the kind of characters, the sort of, the kind of political outlook, the kind of, the humor, the black humor that a lot of your characters have when they're faced with, this kind of mad world that they're in, it comes across as being incredibly authentic. The humor, I mean, Cam is really funny. Like he's really brilliant. I love him as a character. So he's this dentist turned spy. Why not? But he's just even in the darkest times, he's always kind of wisecracking. I love him.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with him because he does have this kind of black humor to him, and writing him, because I found it was an interesting exercise with him because he's the first character I've written in a novel where I'm writing much of his stuff in the first person, and I found that was a helpful way to really, as I wrote more and more, like I felt like I got to know his voice a lot better than if I had written him in the third person. And he's also just this, he's a guy who has a lot going on. He's from Iran, but he didn't really grow up in Iran. He grew up in Sweden. He's Swedish, but then, as he talks about a lot of the novels, like, is he really Swedish? He's got the passport. He grew up in Stockholm, but are you really Swedish? If you came from Iran, he's Iranian, but he's an expat. He's Jewish, but he's not Israeli. So you have this kind of, I think he's one of those characters where he's really struggling with like what he is, and that's kind of a fluid concept at different points in the book. He can kind of present himself in different ways to different people. And And it makes him, I don't know, just kind of a fascinating, I found him to be a fascinating character because he's one of those characters where you start to write a scene with him and you're not always sure where it's going to go. And that's a fun feeling when you have a character who's got that much energy.
I thought it was quite useful to have a character at the heart of a novel like this that isn't ideologically motivated as well, because this could end up being quite sort of, you know, because it is a battle between effectively two different ideologies. And, you know, if your kind of central character had been consumed by that, I think it might have become quite limiting, quite tedious, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think he, you know, he's, when I wrote him, there was part of me that thought, you know, this guy has some aspects of the con man's personality. You know, he's very self-interested and I think, despite, you know, the fact that he does have these kind of charming aspects to him, and I suppose many con men do, you know, he's really in it for himself and very willing, as we see over the course of the novel, to do things to other people that are very destructive, in pursuit, you know, really of his own gain and his kind of, you know, idea that he wants to go to California and sit in the sun and, you know, not worry about anybody else. And that to me was one of the more fascinating parts of his character, because I do, you know, look, the novel's not a morality play. At least I hope it doesn't read that way. But as I got deeper into his character and his sort of situation, I thought, you know, there is kind of this interesting exploration of whether somebody like that can ultimately be forgiven for what they've done, you know, and that to me became an interesting component of the story.
It is not, as you say, a morality play, but obviously morality is hugely involved, because what we're talking about is two rival operations to take out the individuals on the other sides of a kind of conflict that's sort of behind the scenes. So your main Israeli character is Arik Glitzman, and I thought he was just fantastically drawn. I mean, he's quite politically hard-headed. He says at one point, Israel, which I thought was a really wonderful, very short summation of, I think, a lot of what's going on, where he says, Israel must prevail. Power brought a loss of innocence, but what would weakness bring? When Jews went to their knees, they didn't get compromise; they got shot. So this is the Mossad, this is the Israeli ethos, right? And we're seeing it quite a lot at the moment. Did you tell me about writing that character? Were you at all, I wondered, nervous about wading into these waters, given how politically charged they are in your own country as well at the moment?
Yeah, I did do it. I did kind of step into this project with some amount of trepidation and a strong desire that I write the book in a way so that you could step into this, whatever your politics, and still enjoy or find meaning in the story. You know, I did very consciously include, you know, as Glitzman is sort of ruminating throughout the book, you know, it's very clear that Gaza is happening, you know, simultaneously, and that he's having to think about the war there and its repercussions on the Israeli state. Now, he's not working on the Gaza war. He's an Iran guy working for a foreign intelligence service. So it's not really his bailiwick. But yeah, you know, he's an Israeli intelligence officer operating in a world where, you know, there's an incredible amount of, you know, sort of political polarization and division over this topic. And it did give me some concern. I think what I have tried to do in all of the books is what I tried to do in this novel, which is, I'm not asking you to sign up for the ideology or politics of any of these characters. I am trying to sort of faithfully render these people in the setting that they come out of. And hopefully at the end of the book, I want you to sort of wonder what's going to happen next, primarily, so you'll continue to flip the pages and get to the end. But I do hope that, it helps people understand some of the dynamics in this conflict, and helps you understand what might an Israeli intelligence officer be thinking about this? How might an Iranian intelligence officer be thinking about this? I'm not asking you to, I'm not creating, and hopefully not in, sort of tipping my cards on what I actually, think about what's going on. But I think there could be a tendency in I don't know, in the very political world we live in these days, where you kind of think, okay, well, if a guy's writing a book that's got an Israeli intelligence officer in it, he must be sort of signing up for the whole project, and kind of thinking like, well, this, no, I think what I'm trying to do is to say, these are interesting characters, hopefully. And when you get to the end, you as the reader, you can kind of make your own decisions about whether you think they made, good, bad, or ugly decisions themselves throughout the way. I think it's more authentic, or I hope it's more authentic to the way humans actually are, because we're all sort of double agents in our own hearts anyway, right? And I try to write characters that reflect that reality of human nature, be they Israelis or Iranians or Syrians or Americans or Brits.
I thought the way the kind of that absolutely, you nailed it for what it's worth, that the characters feel like real people with real opinions and real lives. So just
Thank you.
And you kind of build it up through detail. So one of the details I really loved was when Glitzman first goes to recruit Cam, he pretends to be a dental patient, and he's
yeah,
and he's
I had fun with that.
It was so much fun. And then Cam notices that how ground down his teeth are, because he grinds his teeth because he's so stressed all the time. And then Cam sort of says, if I'd known what his life was like, I'd be as astonished there's any teeth left, And there's this kind of beautiful and tender thing where he's got this daughter, and the only time he feels kind of safe is when he's lying in bed next to his daughter when she's taking her afternoon nap, and that sort of, I found that incredibly affecting. But then on the other side, you make, one of his first targets early in the book is a scientist, and then we follow that scientist's widow and how her life has been upended by this, hit on her husband from space. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, the way they're taking each other out this is a weird kind of warfare that we're going to have to get used to, isn't it? This sort of way of taking out other humans at such distance and being so far away from the, from the actual blood. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think, it's a balance. It's a balance of the genre these days, I think, of trying to retain the focus on humans and human stories and the very human characters in the books, and also integrating the sort of technological reality all around us. And that's gotten harder because, as you point out, that we're not so much killing at close range anymore, and in the novel, this is happening with sort of kamikaze drones on both sides, right? And it's also affecting, how we communicate with each other. So just people are communicating, more and more, and they're not in the same place. And so I think it's a struggle. I think for us, or at least I hope, maybe I'm the only one having it. I hope not. I presume not. But I think a lot of us spy writers are sort of dealing with the reality that the game is changing, and thus the way it's depicted in novels needs to change as well.
Absolutely. And I think you're definitely not the only one who deals with who kind of is managing that. And I did think one thing that you brought out very fascinatingly for me was the fact that there's this sort of central irony that Iran is a kind of surveillance state, right? Because it's a totalitarian state in a modern era. And that's used against it by Mossad, which is basically surveilling the surveillance, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. That kind of, that dynamic was one of the many that I found really interesting in the book.
Yeah. Yes.
And just to briefly touch again on the politics of this, one of the things I thought you said at the beginning of the interview that there were no Americans in this book. And I thought that was a fascinating decision, because one of the reasons I thought that was such an interesting decision is because with all of this, there's such a tendency for ourselves in the West to kind of put ourselves at the center of all these stories.
Yeah.
And this is, and in a way that it's astonishing, really, because the very people who are kind of most anti-imperial or whatever, or most anti the West being the center of the world, are the people who seem to be centering the West in these stories. And what I thought you did by not having any Americans in this novel at all is make it quite clear that there is an entire story going on that has absolutely nothing to do with the West at all. Obviously, we're involved, but we're not the protagonists in all the stories.
Yeah.
Was that part of the thinking?
Well, I'll describe to you how it came about, because I started writing the novel with Americans in it. And the premise was that it was going to be a joint operation between the CIA and Mossad. And two things kind of happened essentially all at once when I got about a third of the way into that book. Was I realized in the back of my head that the story felt overly full and complicated and not as director engaging or fast moving as it could have been if I just had one intelligence service running the operation. And then two, as I spent more time, in particular, speaking with my CIA friends about the sorts of operations we run with Mossad, the more kinetic said operation is going to be inside Iran, the less likely the CIA is to participate with Mossad. So case in point, the targeted killings that have been conducted against Iranian scientists and engineers and things like that, the CIA doesn't participate in those, right? We don't supply the Israelis with intelligence to enable them. We don't conduct them alongside the Israelis. The Israelis don't tell us before they're going to happen. They just happen, and we don't ask questions, and the Israelis don't tell us. That's more or less how they go down. And so I had a kind of authenticity problem in that if this operation that the Israelis are trying to run, or that we were presumably going to jointly run in Iran over the course of the novel, is aimed at killing individuals inside Iran, then, I'm going to mangle the reality of of how those things would typically go. So those two things kind of collided into each other. And I thought, I'm going to have a cleaner story. I'm going to have a more authentic story. And to your point, I think, on not centering us as the sort of main character, I think the reality is that the Israelis are doing far more inside Iran than we are, and that the shadow war we're involved in some ways, but it is principally a shadow conflict between the Israelis and the Iranians. And so it just made sense to eliminate the CIA piece and to just focus all of my energies, on that kind of central spinal conflict.
Do you think, though, that, because the CIA and all spy agencies have a culture, right? So Mossad's got a long tradition of taking people out beyond its borders, right? And CIA culture is slightly different. It's maybe more about sort of systems rather than taking out people. But then do you think they're becoming a bit more Mossadi under Donald Trump? So, it was Trump who ordered the strike on Soleimani, wasn't it? So, that was an American CIA operation, which was, and we've looked what's been going on with in Venezuela. Is this CIA getting a bit more Mossadi, or is it just CIA culture evolving because of Trump? What's the best way of looking at it?
Well, I think if we are to accept the journalistic accounts of the Predator war over Afghanistan and Pakistan over the past 20 years, the CIA has conducted its fair share of killings, right? So I don't necessarily think that those two aspects that is really like a kind of a differentiating aspect for the organizations. I think the way we go about doing targeted killing operations is a little bit different, and obviously we have a different bureaucratic and legal process for approving those things. Mossad has something else that's still a process, but is much, my understanding is kind of looser and less formal. So, I think the agencies are not so dissimilar that they do those kind of operations. What I did find just in kind of doing, having conversations with CIA officers about Mossad and then having conversations with Mossad officers about Mossad was I think Mossad is more, it's less bureaucratic. It has a much higher risk tolerance than the CIA. I think it has a more, this probably comes with being less bureaucratic and smaller. There's a sort of cultural, tendency for even lower ranking officers inside Mossad who might have a good idea to get, if it's a good idea, it's much more likely to sort of get traction and get tried. I also think the way that the Israelis organize themselves inside Mossad is it's much less about the overall bureaucratic structures and much more about they'll kind of pull a team together for an operation, and that team will kind of get put together on the fly as the operation gets going and then disbanded potentially afterward. Whereas the CIA has a tendency to cooperate kind of more rigidly along bureaucratic lines. So there were a lot of differences between the two intelligence agencies that I felt like I kind of had to wrap my head around for the book. I think, in regards to your question, Antonia, about, is the CIA going to get more Mossadi? To the extent that involves more aggressive covert action work in our near abroad in the Western Hemisphere, I could definitely see that. And that's probably already happening. The CIA didn't obviously, conduct the raid to apprehend Nicolas Maduro, and it wasn't done under CIA covert action authorities because it was a law enforcement operation. That was the way it was done legally. That said, I think it shows that there's more of a willingness to kind of take different elements of our, the pointy tip of our spear and use them, which is very Mossad-like.
I think a point that I think I think I was going to present this as my own point, but I think it might be one that you made on one of your podcasts, so I can't dress it up as my own. Is that
well, we'll see. I don't know. I can't take credit for it yet. I need to hear it
wait
first.
and hear if it's any good. So another one of the differences also being that Mossad has a very narrow theatre of operation, whereas the CIA's is the world, right? So even though, as you say, maybe there's a kind of more of an emphasis on immediate kind of American neighbours and or Greenland, the CIA still does have a brief to cover everything, whereas Mossad is very targeted, very focused, very sort of, has a narrower remit, and that helps.
Yes, absolutely, it does. The CIA would have, an analyst looking at Chile's economy, right? Probably multiple analysts looking at Chile's economy. I don't think Mossad does. If Mossad needed to know something about Chile's economy, they would find a way to get it. But they're not sort of bureaucratically staffed to just kind of cover everything. They're very, very focused on the region and then sort of the pieces of that region, be it Hezbollah in South America or whatever, that, affect kind of where they're, the Israeli state, right, and its situation in the Middle East. So it's a different mentality about the kind of the portfolio of their spy service.
There are though strong kind of similarities in the sense that the job is an extraordinarily odd one. Glitzman puts it really well. He says, after a couple of his colleagues have been assassinated, he says, there had been a time 100 foggy years ago when Glitzman would have registered the myriad insanities of life in his chosen profession, and those in particular of the organization he served. But now in his late middle age, that impulse had decayed along with his strength and libido. I thought that was very good. But it's that kind of, the sort of jadedness, the weariness, but also the kind of sense that what you're doing is actually completely bonkers.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because, I think, if Eric Glitzman had worked for, an airline, if he had been a upper middle management at LL, I think he's going to have that similar sense of kind of weariness with just being, in his 50s and kind of tired, and he's maybe not going to have, so that's a commonality, right, that everyone would have, that I try to show in these characters is like, just because you're working in a spy service doesn't mean that you're not a human, right? You're going to have the same natural tendencies that any other human is going to have, right? But at the same time, Eric Glitzman's job is to, kill Iranians, right? So he has a very strange job relative to what most other people do, and yet he's still a person and has those kind of same natural kind of human impulses and desires and motivations and foibles that we all have. And I think that, across all my books, and the Persian's no exception, I try to highlight that because I think it makes the characters both authentic, but then also more interesting and relatable to all of us as we read these novels. Because what they're doing is not, part of the magic is also that what they're doing is not relatable for most of us. And so we feel like we're given a window into the secret world.
We've talked about having a cast of non-American characters, from a kind of political and spy sense. But as a writer, so one of the perspectives you inhabit is that of a Muslim woman called Roya. Now, we've been through a phase, David, where people have been sort of encouraged to stay in their lane when they write characters, right? So you ought to really only write, I was going to say middle-aged white Americans, but I feel is middle-aged young white American men.
Well, now that I'm 40, now that I've just turned 40, I think middle age is appropriate. Yeah.
Okay, so you're rapidly approaching middle age, but did you feel any concern about inhabiting voices from cultures other than your own? Or do you think that movement has passed? I mean, I found it very stifling anyway, so I'd be delighted if you thought it had passed. Do you think? But did you feel any apprehension on that basis?
No, I've never felt any apprehension whatsoever about writing characters that are outside of my own, sort of age, race, nationality, whatever sort of lens you want to take. And I don't know if I wonder if this kind of storm has affected other genres more than commercial spy thrillers, because I have not really, I think in Damascus Station, my first novel, I wrote from the perspective of a Syrian woman. Across my first three books, I've written from the perspective of a, American CIA officer who's a female named Artemis Proctor. In my, third novel, I write from the perspective of a very old Russian man. In the second one, I write from the perspective of two intelligence officers, both female, one Russian, one CIA. In this one, as you note, Roya Shabani is an Iranian widow who's, in her late 20s and Iranian. So I've done it in every single novel. The next book, my fifth book, will be no exception. I think that I have not felt that heat. I know it's out there, and I know that other writers have. But I think the reason I have felt no apprehension whatsoever about doing this is because I think the sort of contention that authors should only write from the characters from the perspective of their own whatever it is just so fundamentally wrong, like on so many levels. And actually, if it were broadly enacted would undermine the complete, like it undermines fiction as a genre, and it undermines so many great pieces of literature. Like we don't, is Anna Karenina, like we sorry, like canceled. Like give me, it's just give me a break. Like it's just nuts. I do think you have to be more careful, I guess, when you're writing characters that they're not like you, because in order to capture their voice appropriately, I think you have to do more work. You have to spend time doing the research, and you have to spend time talking to people who can help you capture that voice and that authenticity so that you don't do it badly. But I'm not sure that doing it badly is any form of sort of appropriation. I think doing it badly just means you've sort of failed in your mission as a writer of fiction to kind of capture the voice of an interesting character and put that down on paper. But yeah, I think the overall claim I find is just kind of nuts, and I don't pay any attention to it.
Good. Well, I'm delighted that you don't. So, David, you mentioned a fifth book. Can you give us any sneak previews? What are we working on? Where are we at?
It's mostly done. We were recording this on January the 12th. I would hope that in the next couple of weeks, I'll have the final touches on it, and it'll be ready to go, at least to my editor. And the premise is basically, what would it look like if there was tremendous strain placed on the relationship between the U.S. and U.K.'s intelligence services, in particular the CIA and SIS, or MI6 as it's most frequently referred to. And how about I put so much strain on that relationship so that pockets of both organizations decide to start spying on each other again? And we'll see what happens. So it was, when I started writing and I thought, I'm going to have to like really kind of bend over backwards to put a lot of pressure on transatlantic relations. And it has been not as hard as I had imagined. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, I can see. You just look at the news. I can imagine there's some, And I shall be watching very carefully, David, if you have any female middle-aged British characters. I'll be watching very carefully to see if you've got them right. I
might need to send you some chapters to look at to make sure I've captured the voice appropriately.
Yeah. Slightly defeated, a bit miserable, hates company. You'll be fine. Listen, thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy as ever. And if anybody out there hasn't got their hands on a copy of The Persian yet, I highly recommend they run out and get one immediately. I think this is going out on publication day, which is very exciting. So go out, get your copy. And thanks for coming on the Spymasters podcast, David.
Antonia, thanks for having me back.